Good evening, all together, and let me start by apologies for our slight delay. Although knowing Jack and also our other guests tonight, I know that the wait was more than worth it. Dear audience, it's suffice to say that this is a very special event for us. This is a book which was, it is, in fact, the basis for our permanent exhibition on Witold Pilecki, and it's written by the co-curator, in fact. It might not come as shocking news to you, but it's about the patron of our institute, which is an obvious, important reason, but not the only one, and not even the most important one. Many of you will be actively using Twitter and possibly be familiar with the sentence, retweet is not an endorsement. I will quote someone where this is more than true. Harald Welzer, from an interview in Stern, the weekly magazine in March, where he said the following: I really enjoyed living in a post-heroic time. I really enjoyed living in a post-heroic time. I think it's a deeply symptomatic sentence. The post-heroic time, let us think for a second what that actually is. And it may seem slightly distant from our main topic tonight, but bear with me, it'll make sense very soon. The post-heroic time can be described as with the metaphor of the Crystal Palace, which has been used by many writers, including Peter Sloterdijk, but also Dostoevsky. It's a utopian place of purely rational living, where we are basically devoid and free of the classical dilemmas of survival and can merely focus on whether the temperature is mild, not hot enough and not cold enough. On February the 24th, it seems, this Crystal Palace broke apart and fell down into bits and pieces. There's another consequence of this. Notions such as good, evil, truth, or virtue have suddenly made a spectacular return. These are notions stemming from traditional metaphysics, and suddenly they don't sound outdated anymore, like Wittgensteinian language games from Dante's poems, just waiting for us to be deconstructed. In fact, they couldn't be more timely. And since this is a new era, we need symbols, narratives, heroes, stories, simply put, content to fill the aforementioned notions with. There's no shortage of contemporary examples, the most obvious one being the Ukrainian nation, which right now fights for its and our freedom. There's also no shortage of historic examples, but hardly anyone is, again, as timely as Witold Pilecki in this regard. Most of you will be familiar with the so-called Böckenförde dictum, that a liberal secularized state lives by prerequisites which it cannot guarantee itself. And it seems that post-heroic times also live by prerequisites which they cannot guarantee themselves. The Crystal Palace, the 50 years of unimaginable welfare, peace, human rights that we had, at least in the West, were fought for 50 years ago and defended by the Allies. They didn't just come by Maradona's God's hand, so to speak. And who else would symbolize this paradigm shift better than Witold Pilecki, who fought against both totalitarianisms in the 20th century, who was a faithful Catholic traditionalist and at the same time always supported his wife as a teacher, community activist, and in her artistic endeavors, who fought for the multi-ethnic and multicultural Poland, which he called home. We need the lessons of Witold Pilecki today more than ever. His ethics was one of relative theoretical modesty, but of practical maximalism. All too often it is exactly the other way around. And finally, after this introduction, we'll learn more about Witold Pilecki himself, thanks to Jack Fairweather, who's here tonight joining us, the author of this book, but so much more, born in 1978, The Volunteer was translated into over 25 languages. As said before, he's the co-curator of our current exhibition and also of its updated version, which will be released soon. As a journalist, he worked for a long time as a war reporter, as the bureau chief of the Daily Telegraph in Baghdad, and reporting regularly from the Middle East for the Washington Post. His work won the British Press Award and Costa Book of the Year Award, among others. And we are also joined by Sieglinde Geisel, who's a cultural journalist, book author, writing coach. From 1994 till 1998, she was a cultural correspondent for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in New York. She teaches writing workshops at university, has been observing the German historical discourse for quite a while, and that's why we thought she'll be an amazing counterpart for Jack Fairweather. Let me also mention that there's one very special guest tonight among here who makes the spirit of history alive, but I was asked by Jack Fairweather not to disclose at this time who that person is. More details coming soon. And one more last point, which is a homage to the publisher, thanks to whom this book is being released. I'm sure you're familiar with a certain situation where you have like your favorite book authors, movies, music albums, or whatsoever, and you've been consuming it for 10 years, and then you suddenly meet a friend for whom the first time is just awaiting. And then you tell him or her, you know what, I'm envious, because you are about to listen to the album for the first time or read this book for the first time. And guess what, the audience? This is exactly such a book. That's why I would not only recommend purchasing it, but having it signified by Jack Fairweather, which he promised us to do afterwards. And I think this somewhat over lengthy, hopefully not too much introduction, comes to a deserved end. And Jack, I would like to say the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Have a sip of tea. Is this good sound? Yes. I hope so. So when I started writing about Witold Pilecki, the events of World War II seemed like history, impossibly far away from our present time. The war in Ukraine has changed our connection to the past, and I hope you will find in Pilecki's story, which I will share with you now, that it's more relevant than ever. I'd like to begin by asking you to picture a scene with me. 6 a.m. on September the 19th, 1940, and a Polish underground operative named Witold Pilecki is in an apartment in the Żoliborz district of Warsaw. This is a wartime image of that apartment. Pilecki was on the 3rd floor. And here he is. Okay. Here is Pilecki in his favorite plaid jacket, sitting on the right with a fellow conspirator. Pilecki, when this picture was taken, was 38 years old. He was a reserve officer in the Polish cavalry, a farmer, a devout Catholic, and a father of 2. Here is Pilecki sitting on his farmhouse steps in eastern Poland with a friend. This is a picture of his wife, Maria, who was a school teacher in their village. And this is a favorite picture of the two of them together. It says, oh, maybe there. Okay, good. This is Witold and Maria on their wedding day. And you can see him sort of thrusting his chest out as she pins on a lapel or a flower. And this is the family. The 2 kids, Andrei and Zofia, in fancy dress, and one of the few sort of family photos just before the war, Pilecki in his reserve officer's uniform. Before the war, Poland was one of the most pluralistic societies in Europe. A tenth of the population is Jewish, the largest such community in Europe. Then the Germans invaded. Here we see German troops parading through Warsaw under the eye of Adolf Hitler in October 1939. This was a month after the German invasion of Poland. Hitler hadn't formulated his plans to annihilate Europe's Jews at that stage. He was intent at that point on the destruction of Poland by eliminating its professional classes. Here we see a roundup in the western city of Bydgoszcz. Poland was subject to a brutal reign of terror, and thousands of Poles, doctors, teachers, writers, Jews and Catholics alike, were dragged from the streets to be shot or interned. 50,000 Polish nationals were murdered in the first 4 months of the occupation, a just staggering figure. The following year, in May 1940, the Germans opened a new concentration camp to hold some of the prisoners they were seizing from the streets. The name of that camp was Auschwitz. Here we see a pre-war map of Poland. Pilecki's village was in the top right-hand corner with the arrow, Krupa, and the second arrow points to the Polish city of Oswiecim, which was the home to the new concentration camp. Little was known about what was happening inside, but Pilecki had learned from informants that a roundup was scheduled for Żoliborz that morning, and that those arrested were to be sent to Auschwitz. Indeed, that's why he was sitting in the apartment. His mission was to infiltrate the camp, forge a resistance cell, and gather evidence of Nazi crimes. Let's go back to that apartment and picture now, or listen now, as Pilecki did, to the rumble of trucks pulling to a stop outside the apartment. Shouts and gunshots follow. The building caretaker bangs on the door. His sister-in-law, whose place it is, answers. "It's a German roundup," says the caretaker. "Get out while you still can." Then they hear the sound of the Germans entering the building. What does Pilecki do? He calmly puts on his jacket and then notices his 3-year-old nephew sitting up wide-eyed in bed. The boy's teddy bear lies on the floor. And as the door bursts open, Pilecki picks up the toy and hands it to his nephew. "See you soon," he whispers to the child. And then, against every instinct he must have had, he steps into captivity. 3 days later, he arrives in Auschwitz. Here we have a famous post-war picture of the camp taken by Soviet forces in 1945, with those terrible words, "Arbeit macht frei," over the doorway. And here is a picture now of Pilecki as a prisoner. Over the next 2.5 years, Pilecki forged an underground army in Auschwitz that sabotaged facilities, assassinated SS officers, and plotted an armed uprising. He arrived in Auschwitz at its beginning as a concentration camp for Polish nationals. Thus, he witnessed the steps by which the Nazis conceived of and built their death factory for Europe's Jews. He was the first to report to the world on the camp's horrors through his smuggled reports. He was the first to try and stop them. 3 years before Allied commanders publicly acknowledged Auschwitz's existence, Pilecki was urging them through his reports to bomb the camp. And yet, for all of his exploits in Auschwitz, his story is almost unknown. Indeed, I only heard of it by chance. In 2011, I met up with a reporter friend of mine, Matt McAllister. We covered the wars together in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. This is actually a picture of a suicide car bombing that I was caught in Mosul, Iraq. I was in the tank to the right as a suicide car bomber drove into it. And this is a picture of the ambush and firefight that followed. That's me in my press jacket on the bottom left. Matt had traveled to Auschwitz and learned about a resistance cell in the camp. The idea that anyone could resist the Nazis in a place like that was a shock to me. I think, like a lot of you, I thought of the camp as the ultimate symbol of suffering and victimhood. Pilecki seemed to offer a startling new way to see the camp, not through the eyes of a victim, but through those of a protagonist. I also felt personally challenged by the story, because when I began my research, I was the same age as Pilecki, as he had been at the start of World War II, and like him, I also had a wife, 2 kids, and a home. What would make Pilecki risk everything on such a mission? And what was it about this act of volunteering that spoke so powerfully to me? I knew I had to find out more, and that was when I discovered that other startling fact about Pilecki, that so little had been written about him. I managed to glean a little online that Pilecki had gone on to fight the communist takeover of Poland at the end of World War II. He'd been captured and executed by the communist regime. All trace of his wartime record was either destroyed or locked away in military archives. In fact, even mentioning Pilecki's name in Poland after the war could lead to arrest. It wasn't until 2012 that one of Pilecki's reports, written at the end of the war, was finally translated into English. Here is a picture of that report, and that's actually Pilecki's own looping handwriting in blue crayon around the edge. He wrote this very quickly before he took up arms again against the communists. And this is where that report sits today, in a rather nondescript suburban house in Ealing, West London. This building is actually the home of the Polish Underground Study Trust, which became a repository for lots of reports of the underground, which have been kept there for the years since the war. And Pilecki's report is in that beige folder you can see on the second shelf. I always find this picture amazing because when I think of Pilecki's report and its significance, I think it should be in Yad Vashem or the National Archive in Warsaw, not in a filing cabinet in a semi in Ealing. What Pilecki wrote in this report only deepened the mystery for me, though, because the report was filled with gaps. Names were hidden to protect colleagues, events obscured or omitted, and the report also left unanswered the crucial questions. What happened to the intelligence Pilecki risked his life to gather? Why were his calls for action unheeded by the Allies? And indeed, how many lives might have been saved had the world listened? 5 years ago now, I set off to try and answer these questions and the deeper mystery of his motivation. I flew to Warsaw on a reporting trip. And the first person I wanted to meet was Pilecki's son, Andrzej. I was a little nervous ahead of meeting him. After all, who was I to suddenly alight on his father's story? Andrzej had been little more than a child when his father was executed. Here he is, again in fancy dress with his sister. For 50 years, Andrzej had been told that his father was an enemy of the state. He was only able to start learning details of his father's mission in the 1990s when the communist archives were opened. Of course, I shouldn't have worried about meeting Andrzej because he was the kindest... Jesus Christ. Oh... He was the kindest, loveliest man, and here he is in his armchair. A very common scene of my research, having some tea and cake and a lovely experience. He did warn me, though, on that first meeting when I met him, I'm not sure what you'll find out about my father. So I told him, I'm starting with you, Andrei. Anything that you can tell me about your father's thinking is going to be important, because I felt that I couldn't recreate Pilecki's story beyond what he himself had written or what people like Andrei could tell me about his thinking. What I found amazing on my trip to Warsaw was how many people were still alive who had known Pilecki. Some had never shared their memories before, either because they dared not or simply because no one had asked them. People like Bohdan Valesek and Jerzy Szakczewski. Both of these men fought alongside Pilecki in the Warsaw Uprising. They'd never spoken of their experience of fighting with Pilecki. In addition to gathering living testimony, I also wanted to follow in Pilecki's footsteps as much as possible. Much was destroyed by the Warsaw Uprising, but some of the key sites still existed, and none were more important for me than the apartment where Pilecki was arrested. And that was the next place I wanted to visit on my first reporting trip. And this is a picture of the apartment when I visited it. And of course, I wanted to get inside if possible. So here we are entering the building, and 3 flights up to the apartment where Pilecki was staying, to number 7. And we knocked on the door and there was no answer. So, of course, we were a little bit disappointed not to be able to see inside. So my researcher, Marta, suggested, why don't we record some audio of what it must have sounded like when the Germans came barreling up the stairs. So she did just that. I had my tape recorder out, and she came up to the door and bang, 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 Gestapo style. And of course, it was that what was needed to wake up the rather sleepy residents inside, because Pilecki's, this apartment was a student flat, and here is the rather sleepy resident who getting woken up at midday. He had no idea of the historical significance of the place, or indeed that his bedroom was the very spot where Pilecki volunteered for his mission to Auschwitz. You can see a little bit untidy. So to describe scenes like this, I knew I was going to see them with my own eyes, but even better was when I could combine locations with witnesses of Pilecki in action. So you may remember the 3-year-old nephew of Pilecki I mentioned, to whom he handed the teddy bear. Well, turned out that that boy, Marek, was still alive. Here he is sitting on the lap of Pilecki, and here he is when I got to meet him in Warsaw in his early 80s. I took Marek back to the apartment, and it was the first time he'd been back in over 70 years, as his family had been kicked out by the communists after the war. So I got to take him inside, and here you can see him confirming that that was the door indeed, that's the original door. And here he is telling us about the layout of the furniture in the room. Bringing Marek back to the apartment made him remember the moment with the teddy bear that for me spoke so eloquently of Pilecki's ability when under extraordinary stress to look beyond himself. Then Marek recalled the moment that Pilecki was arrested. I'm not sure if you could fully hear that, but you can see for sure that Marek is tearing up at the end of that clip, and it was definitely the case that he was in tears at the end of our visit, recalling what the visit had meant to him. All right. Oh. Can you still hear me? Yes, good. Apologies for technical difficulties. To write this book in the vivid and compelling way that I wanted to, I knew I was going to need hundreds, if not thousands, of details like that teddy bear. And it was only upon visiting the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum that I realized where I'd find them. Since the museum's inception in 1946, its archive has collected over 3,000 prisoner testimonies by camp survivors, hundreds of which either touched on Pilecki's work or described events that he would have witnessed in the camp. Most had never been translated or published before. So I'd like to go back now to the moment that Pilecki arrives in the camp. We'll just skip ahead a little. This is some of the research areas in the camp. This is the collection of the testimonies and a rather remarkable diary that was kept by one of Pilecki's colleagues actually in the camp that was smuggled out. So now picture with me September the 21st, 1940, 3 days after his mission had begun, and a light rain is falling. The train screeches to a halt. Men in the cattle truck with Pilecki get to their feet. They hear shouts and dogs barking, doors being slammed open, and then it's their turn. They're blinded by spotlights and then dragged from the train, beaten, punched, kicked, forced through the gates you see there. Pilecki was then stripped and shaved and issued with striped prison clothes and given a camp number to replace his name. Now, there are no photographs of that horrific arrival in the camp, but extraordinarily, some of the survivors after the war drew images of what it was like to arrive in Auschwitz, which I'd like to share with you tonight. Here is one such image. It's the moment when they were being stripped and washed. The water was always either boiling or too cold. Jewish prisoners at this point were often identified by their circumcisions and were given special beating, although this was before the camp had become the center of the final solution, before Hitler's plans to exterminate Europe's Jews had coalesced. Here we have a very rare photograph of the early camp from 1941. To the left, you see the roll call square, which is where the prisoners, which now included Pilecki, would gather for 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening, to be counted. Here's another piece of artwork showing one of those roll calls. You can see the dead were gathered in the evening to be counted for the final time before their bodies were taken to the crematorium just outside the camp gates. This was a photograph of the ovens, the first ovens in Auschwitz that had been built a few weeks before Pilecki's arrival, and there are SS documents saying that already that these 2 ovens would not be enough for cremating all that were dying in the camp through malnutrition and from being beaten. Now, Pilecki's reports from 1945 describes his first days in the camp vividly, but I wanted more. The more details I could find, I could use to recreate scenes. The closer I could then come to understanding Pilecki's responses. That's what I wanted after all, a way to delve into his thinking and start answering the question, how was resistance possible in a place like Auschwitz? Now, Pilecki doesn't describe the moment when he started recruiting for the underground, but I discovered a testimony by one of his first recruits, a young man called Konstanty Pilecki, or Kon for short. Here is Kon's mugshot, and this is what he had to say. He described how evening, a week or so into Pilecki's time into the camp, they were gathering outside the blocks just before evening curfew. They would meet at this area of the main camp called Birkenalley on the count of the birch trees. And all of the prisoners who were gathered then were starving on rations of less than 1,000 calories a day, forced to do back-breaking hard labor around the camp, covered by welts and bruises from the beatings they received every day. You can see one of the German functionaries delivering one such beating in the background. And I think this picture sort of captures the nervousness of the moment. And this was when Pilecki took Con to one side and revealed to him the secret of the underground, which at that stage consisted of pretty much just Pilecki. And Con's response to Pilecki makes me smile because of its honesty. He says, to paraphrase, "Pilecki, are you nuts? Look at us. We are in no fit state to oppose the Germans." But then Con realized something. He realized that Pilecki, by revealing his mission for the underground, had entrusted Con with his life. Because Con could shop Pilecki to the Germans if he wanted to for a loaf of bread. But he didn't, because he realized that Pilecki was offering him something that was more important than food. He was offering trust and hope that something greater than themselves could endure in the camp. Of course, Pilecki knew that hope itself would not be enough. He knew that they needed to start fighting back. He had initially thought about staging a breakout, but realized that would be impossible given the condition of the prisoners, and they would need help from the outside. So he started gathering intelligence to persuade the Allies to intervene. Of course, that posed the question, how on earth do you get intelligence to the Allies from a place like that? He thought about escape, but that was too dangerous. Plus, any attempts were punished with harsh reprisals against the other prisoners in the camp. But then about a month into his time in Auschwitz, Pilecki learned that one of the prisoners was going to be released because his family had paid the right bribes in Warsaw. Pilecki approached the man and persuaded him to carry a report to the underground leadership in Warsaw. He couldn't write anything down, that would be too dangerous, so he had the man memorize his words verbatim. What were those words, whispered by Pilecki one evening on Roll Call Square, under the noses of the Nazi guards? No one has succeeded in tracking down this report. All that Pilecki gives us is the name of his messenger, Alexander Wielopolski. And here is a picture of Alexander. Armed with that name, my researcher, Louisa, was able to track down Alexander's son, an elegant gentleman in his 80s named Piotr. This is Piotr when I met him. He had no idea that his father was one of Pilecki's messengers. But crucially, he was able to give us a guess of who his father's host in Warsaw had been, a man called Dębinski. So that gave my other researcher, Marta, the clue she needed. A few months later, she called me up from that archive in Ealing, West London, and I could hear the emotion in her voice. She said, "Jack, I've found Pilecki's report." That name, Dębinski, allowed her to sift through the thousands of underground reports and missives stored in the archive to find the one folder of documents that charted the progress of Pilecki's report across occupied Europe to the Polish government in exile in London. This is what Pilecki had to say, and I think it captures both his desperation and his clear-sightedness. We beg the Polish government, for the love of God, to bomb the camp and end our torment. Should we die in the attack, it would be a relief given the conditions. This is the urgent and well-considered request sent on behalf of comrades by the witness of their torment. Already in 1940, Pilecki recognized that what was happening in Auschwitz was so terrible it was worth his life and everyone else's in the camp if it meant destroying Auschwitz. I dug around some more and discovered that Pilecki's report was handed on to the head of the RAF, Charles Portal. I found the correspondence between Portal and his commanders about whether or not it was possible to bomb Auschwitz. I'd like to pause here to consider that remarkable achievement of Pilecki's. His words, composed in the direst conditions imaginable, now being discussed at the highest level of the British government. Pilecki didn't just do this once. By my count, he sent at least 10 reports via secret messengers from the camp that charted its evolution to a death factory. He described the start of the program to euthanize sick prisoners, early gas experiments against Soviet POWs. All of his reports made it to London. Each of them called on the Allies to take action. That's why his work in the camp is so historically important. He was revealing to the world just how the Nazis could conceive of murder on an industrial scale. Then in the summer of 1942, the first transports bearing Jewish families from all over Europe began arriving in a vast new camp named Birkenau the Nazis were constructing nearby. It was the start of the Holocaust. Here we see Birkenau in the top left-hand corner. The main camp is to the right, the bottom right-hand corner. This was where Pilecki was staying. He couldn't himself travel to Birkenau. He had to rely on his recruits, his network of men that he had positioned around the camp. And this brings me to a rather lovely point in this presentation, which is to introduce you to one of Pilecki's co-workers, one of the great heroes of the camp resistance, a man called Henryk Peremski. And of course, the reason it's so special for me is because his daughter, Ilona, is in the audience tonight, and I'm so honored that she could come and join us from Stuttgart. Thank you, Ilona, and also thank you to your amazing dad. He was an electrician, a prisoner electrician working around Birkenau. He witnessed the gas chambers, the first gas chambers being built, and was able to pass on that news to Pilecki in the main camp. This is a picture of Henryk as a prisoner. Pilecki struggled to grasp the scale of the crime or understand why the Nazis wanted to kill Jewish families. But he knew he had to inform the world at once. This time he was prepared to risk an escape to do so, despite the extreme danger. And Pilecki gives us the name of the messenger again, Stanisław Jasta. But this time he also gives us a few more details about how his report got out, and I think you'll understand why, because this is one of the most extraordinary escapes from any concentration camp during the war. 4 of Pilecki's men stole SS uniforms from a warehouse, dressed up as SS officers, marched over to Commandant Hers's garage, took his car, and drove out of the gates. One of those acts of ingeniousness and creativity that Pilecki displayed time and time again in the camp. Jasta didn't survive the war and left no testimony, but it turned out that one of the escapers, Kazimierz Piechowski, did, and here is Kazik, as he is known, and turned out that he was still alive when I was researching. Here he is at 96 when I got to meet him in Gdansk. And with Kazik's help, he was able to date the moment when Jasta split from the group to deliver his report to Warsaw. And here is a copy of that report that finally made its way to London, describing the remarkable start of the Holocaust in the camp that through Henryk Peremski, through Witold Pilecki, was able to inform the world of the horrors of Auschwitz. This was an agonizing moment for Pilecki in the camp. By the summer of 1942, he built up an underground of almost 1,000 men. He had an uprising plan ready to go. He had identified a reserve arms depot to raid, knew which bridges they were to blow to cripple the camp. He'd even begun assassinating SS officers. Pilecki was waiting for a signal. In fact, he'd even stolen a radio transmitter from the Germans, from a workshop in the camp, to be able to broadcast directly to the Allies, telling them what was happening in Auschwitz. But no word came, and Pilecki struggled to understand why. He wondered whether he'd failed to capture adequately the horrors of the camp. The scale of the murder was increasing rapidly. When his messenger Yasta had escaped, 35,000 Jews had died in the camp. By the end of 1942, that number stood at 200,000. This is an amazing drawing of Pilecki that was made inside the camp around this time and that managed to survive and gives us a sense, I think, of Pilecki at this moment, contemplating what to do. You see the heaviness of his brow. He wasn't going to give up, but he felt a very powerful sense of shame that he could do nothing, despite all of his men, to stop the murder that was going on around him. He used that feeling to push him to a final act of heroism in the camp. Pilecki decided that he himself would need to escape Auschwitz in order to rally a force to attack the camp. The question he faced was how, because he couldn't steal SS uniforms again and take Commandant Hirsch's car. The guards were aware now of that escape route. Instead, he began to explore the sewers during the winter and early spring of 1943. This is me also exploring the sewers, and what I discovered when going down there was the same thing as Pilecki, that down these tunnels eventually came to a grill that, unfortunately for Pilecki, led out onto Commandant Hirsch's back garden and his dog kennel. So this was not the way to escape. Pilecki kept on looking. He knew he had to, because every day that passed, more were dying in the camp. That spring of 1943, larger gas chambers were being constructed in Birkenau to turn the camp into a true death factory, with the capacity to kill 4,500 people per day. Here are some plans for those new gas chambers. Amazingly, we have this plan here today because it was stolen by Pilecki's men from the office of the SS architects in the camp and smuggled out. But Pilecki finally hit on a desperate plan to escape himself. He'd learned of a bakery that was staffed by guards, and he arranged to get transferred into the baker's unit. And so with two other prisoners, they hatched this plan of dashing from the bakery during the night shift and then embarking on a 100-mile journey across Nazi-occupied Poland to a safe house in the hills outside Krakow. And once again, the best way to discover how such a feat was possible was to try and follow in his footsteps. The bakery no longer exists, but I was able to locate the spot where the bakery had stood. It's actually next to that McDonald's. And so the same time of night, the same time of year, I set off to recreate Pilecki's escape, to locate where it was that he crossed the Wisła River, and then made a mad dash across the fields to pause briefly in those woods you can see in the distance. Of course, Pilecki, that wasn't the end of his journey. He had to go all those miles away to the town of Nowy Wiśniowice, you can see on the right-hand side there. And that was where he found the safe house. It's a wartime image of the house. And this is what it looked like when I got to visit. There's Pilecki, thin and emaciated after his escape, and his host in the safe house. And you can see it looks pretty much the same as when Pilecki visited it. That little girl in the previous picture, that is that little girl now, Maria, 80 years later, serving us tea and telling us that at that table we were sitting was where Pilecki composed his first report as a free man about his experience in the camp. And I think as a biographer, you're always in pursuit of your subject. And it was sitting at that table when I finally felt that I had got to catch up with Pilecki for a moment. But for all of Pilecki's feats in the camp, his escape, his desperate struggle against the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising, his stand against Poland's communists after the war, I find myself coming back to the Warsaw apartment and Pilecki's first act of courage. And here's why. Because in the act of volunteering, Pilecki set himself on a trajectory that was different to every other prisoner sent to the camp. Pilecki was there by choice. He chose to go to Auschwitz. He chose to form an underground cell. He chose to smuggle reports out of the camp. Why is that act of choosing so important? Because he reminds us that empathizing with the suffering of others beyond our immediate friends and family is also a choice. As the fate of his report shows, it's not the instinctive response of many to seek to come to the rescue of others, especially if they themselves are in danger or facing hardship. But just because it's not our instinctive reaction, that doesn't absolve us from taking action ourselves. The Nazis were counting on the world turning away from their crimes. This is what Simon Wiesenthal recounts being told by an SS guard in 1944. However this war may end, we have won the war against you. None of you will be left to bear witness. But even if someone were to survive, the world would not believe him. Pilecki asks us, no matter how gruesome the subject, no matter how difficult our own circumstances, we never stop trying to understand the plight of others. This is the last photograph taken of Pilecki as a free man shortly before his arrest by the communists. He died believing that he had failed to deliver his message for the world to take action against Auschwitz. My hope is that this book will show that it wasn't Pilecki that failed. In fact, he succeeded in alerting the world. The failure to take action lies elsewhere. So for the past 5 years or so, I've been compelled to follow in Pilecki's footsteps. As a reporter, I've always been drawn to extremes, and I found none greater than Pilecki's story of survival in Auschwitz. It describes the worst that we can do to each other and, surprisingly, some of the best. My book came out in English in 2019. It's been translated, as Patrick mentioned, into over 25 languages, and this forms the basis of the exhibition here. I was also able to find the name of a Jewish family that Pilecki saved when he arrived in Warsaw in 1943 after escaping the camp. I'm in the process of applying for him to be recognized by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among the nations. I've come to believe that Pilecki is one of the greatest heroes of World War II. If you read this book, I know you will be inspired like I have been. So please help me in sharing Pilecki's remarkable story and join me in following his footsteps. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? I'm afraid you can. Can you turn me up? So.
It's okay.
Oh, Now, it's better now? Yes. Yeah, now it gets better. Okay. Yeah, my name is Siglinde Geisel, as Patrick has already told you, and I feel very honored to talk to Jack Fairweather now. I've read the book in the last few days, and I must say it's one of the most gripping readings I've had. I missed tram stops when I was compelled to read it in the tram, because you really can't stop reading. Also, you kind of feel you can't go on because it's so horrible what you witness. And I was reminded reading it by a sentence of Thomas Harlan, whose book I have here. Thomas Harlan was the son of Veit Harlan, the most famous film director of the Nazis. And he was 16 when the war finished, and then only he recognized that he had grown up with a band of eine Räuberbande, as he said, like a criminal gang. And then he helped Fritz Bauer to prosecute Nazis with researches in Poland, and that's also why I have not met you, but we have emailed Jack Fairweather, had asked me about Thomas Harlan. I've written about him. And Thomas Harlan said, in our consciousness, the murder of the Jews has not happened. And that's, of course, he means we have not really understood what has happened, the significance and the dimensions of that. And when I read your book, I felt so, I started understanding what has happened. It really transfers something, it reaches us emotional in a way that other kinds of remembrances don't. And it's a similar effect like this book, you use it as a source, Menschen in Auschwitz by Hermann Langbein. And it's also, this book I almost really couldn't read because you really start understanding what has happened. When it enters your consciousness, then something does happen. And I find it incredible. You said it's one of the most important heroes, or maybe the most important hero of the Holocaust. And of course, it's also the most unknown of all the heroes. I would like to ask you, has anybody of you known Pilecki before the Pilecki-Institut made the exhibition here? One, okay, that's great. Because me too, I had never heard of Pilecki until Patrick Sostak invited me here and showed me you also. Okay, so we have two. And so it's really incredible. And I'm sure that Hermann Langbein, who was at the same time in Auschwitz as Pilecki for like, I think 1.5 years. I mean, they hadn't met.
6 months.
6 months only. But according to your researchers, they hadn't met, did they? Yeah, I looked up the register, and I found 5 passages with Pilecki, but it was another one. It was a Jan Pilecki who was just a Blogschreiber. So that's amazing that even among those who had shared his experiences, he was not known. And I'm sure if Thomas Harlan, who died in 2010, had known about Pilecki, he would have made him a character in this book that features on the perpetrators of the Holocaust. Not on Auschwitz, on the Aktion Reinhardt, but it's the same story in the end. And Hermann Langbein is a character, so I'm sure that Thomas Harlan would have been fascinated by such a person. Yeah, I would like to ask you, how come that such an important person, I mean, on the one hand, the question is, why didn't we know before? But after what you told us, it's more amazing even that we do know it. I mean, how thin is the thread of the tradition that makes us know him?
That report that I showed you an image of, that sat in the house of an underground member who fled to London and kept it secret in his drawer for decades because he was concerned that if it became published, if it became known, there would be further reprisals against Pilecki and his men, Pilecki himself having been executed, but hundreds of others arrested and imprisoned. And so it was actually only in the 70s that report was brought to that archive in Ealing, where it was a brilliant historian called Józef Galiński came across it and wrote a sort of an early history of the resistance in the camp. And in Poland, there was nothing no commemoration of Pilecki's, because the communist authorities saw him and his men as a threat. Here is a guy who rose up against the Nazis. No doubt he will pose a threat to the communists. That's why they clamped down so strongly on his network and made it a crime to talk about them. And it's incredible to me to think of Pilecki's own children not knowing any details about their father and his heroism in the camp until the 90s, when another brilliant Polish academic called Adam Syra tracked down the material in the archives in Poland and shared them with the family and connected up with the work of Galiński. And I'm happy to say Pilecki's story is well known now in Poland. It has been rediscovered. It's just everyone else, it's all the rest of us who've got to catch up with the story. But that thread was non-existent, essentially, for those decades after the war.
Yes, it's extremely fragile. I mean, how easily could that manuscript have been lost and not found again, and nobody really understood what they had in their hands? And also, what makes your book so gripping is that Pilecki has so many times escaped death so narrowly. I mean, that's why you can't stop reading, because, and also the escape, it was incredible what he was able to do, and he must have had nerves of steel. I mean, you also can describe it so vividly because you try to reenact it and to go that way. How was the process of writing? I mean, in a way, you're a journalist, but you also use devices of literary fiction, actually, in creating this. How did you go about that?
Well, I felt very strongly that I couldn't make up any detail in the book, because actually Pilecki, in his own report, he has a preface to that report saying, if I make up any word in this report, it would be a terrible shame in the memory of my comrades who died in the camp. What I tell you, must be the truth as best as I can tell you. And so I felt very strongly that every detail that I put in the book was going to have to be from a testimony, from an interview, from a document. But of course, I also wanted to make it feel, like you say, like a novelistic experience. So that just required an awful lot of work, and I had an amazing research team, as you probably picked up from the talk. Two of my researchers, Marta Golian and Katarzyna Czerzinska, moved to Oswiecim for 2 years to just work on those archives, and we would just read endless testimonies, and there'd be a little detail there or a detail there that would help us create the scene. And I think, well, as you know, there is such rich testimonial experience of World War II that when you bring it together, it is possible to capture the scene, what the weather was like, what was on the menu that day when Pilecki escaped, these sort of details. But yes, I think I really felt strongly that whilst I wanted the story to be one that would make people compelled to read it using literary fiction techniques, that it had to be based on fact as best I could.
Yeah, interesting, because in a way you created a character with Witold Pilecki. I mean, how developed your relationship to this man whom you never met and who had not left so many traces?
Well, I got to spend a lot of time with Andrzej and Zofia and his family and friends who had known him, who were still alive. And I think that begins to give you a sense of the man, hearing the stories of, for example, what he was like as a father or what he was like as a husband. It's of course true, there's no, beyond his reports, we don't have film of him, we don't have audio, there's only these fragmentary memories. So I think it's hard, every biographer struggles to connect with the people that they write about. And I think you look for those little flashes, like at the table in Novi Vižanić when I sat, where you suddenly feel the presence of the person that you're writing about.
What kind of person was he in your imagination now?
Well, you know...
Or in the reports of people who told you about him.
Right. Well, there was one word that so many people used to describe him that actually became a really powerful tool for me to think about how he was able to succeed in Auschwitz doing these extraordinary things. And of course, you know, when we talk about heroes and reach for words like courage and bravery, they tend to make people like Pilecki seem very distant, and you sort of wonder how on earth could he do what he did in the camp. And so many of his friends, especially those who fought alongside him, said that Pilecki had this very special ability that I think maybe we can all relate to in this room, and that was that he was able to trust other people. He had this ability just to share, and that in a place like Auschwitz was a revolutionary act, because of course the camp was designed to break down people according to ethnicity, according to turn them into numbers. And Pilecki, through that ability to trust others, was able to show a different way. And I think in understanding that sort of mechanism for building the underground, it gave me insights into those moments like I described with Con, where he's sort of laying it all on the line, and Con is responding in this human way to this act of human compassion from Pilecki.
This means also that he seems to have been able to preserve his humanity, even under the most inhumane circumstances, which was not self-evident at all.
That is a very special ability of his. It's one in which he constantly lent into the horrors of the camp. He was in Auschwitz for 2.5 years, filing these reports of unspeakable horror that he was either witnessing himself, experiencing in some cases, or hearing from people like Henryk Peremski. And I think that ability of his not to become desensitized to the horrors around him is, of course, one of his great lessons for us today, you know, especially when we think about Ukraine, you know, months into the war, we all reacted with horror as the first stories of atrocities emerged. You know, when we were on to the 10th or the 20th or the 30th, are we reacting in the same way? And, you know, Pilecki struggled himself not to become inured to horror, and he wasn't, and that is, in fact, one of his great acts of courage, not necessarily the escaping or the rallying of men, but the fact that personally he was able to keep looking on into the heart of darkness in Auschwitz.
Yeah, I was astonished that he survived so many close moments, and so I thought, I mean, he could easily have died and we would not be sitting here and talking about him. You wouldn't have had the experience of writing the book. Do you think it's possible that there are more Pileckis than we know of?
That's a great question, because of course it makes me think about Henryk Peremski, who is, you know, one of Pilecki's companions in the camp. Pilecki didn't act alone in Auschwitz. I mean, he needed the support of men like Henryk, who I write about in the book. I write about sort of many of these great heroes who helped sustain Pilecki, who got his reports out of the camp, the couriers who conducted these amazing undercover missions, taking them across Europe to London with Pilecki's reports. So many of them are not known to us in the West. Many are not known even to Poles. You know, the example of Alexander Wielopolski, Pilecki's first messenger in the camp, when I told him about his father's exploits, he had no idea at all. And that is, of course, because Poland suffered the totalitarian occupation of the Soviets for decades after the war. They weren't able to commemorate their heroes, and it was, you know, a great privilege for me to meet people like Ilona and get to talk about her dad and share what I had learned about his work in Auschwitz. There's a cast of great heroes. Probably many could have stories, books written about them too. And of course, I hope that that, you know, is one thing that will happen as we start to discover Polish history in the West and realize what a rich world it is.
One part of reading your book is also a growing frustration with the allies who do not react to these reports. We are witnessing to what great lengths Pilecki and his co-workers go to secure that these messages reach their audience is not the right word, but maybe it is. And you're right, it was not a failure of Pilecki, but it was a failure of the allies, of politicians like Churchill, like Roosevelt, who did not act. Do you have an explanation why there was, and nobody acted? There was not one man who said, apart from Sikorsky, it was nobody who said, we have to do something. It was like a conspiracy against working on that.
Well, this is such an important part of the book, because I think that story of what happened to Pilecki's reports is the story that Pilecki himself never discovered, never knew, and which was really important. I felt important to reveal through the research these moments when the reports would arrive in London and the Allied commanders would respond to them. And there are many individual moments when, you know, to answer that question of yours, why did the Allies not respond? But I think one answer, which again connects to our own time, is that Pilecki himself struggled to understand what was happening in the camp. We have now the word the Holocaust, we know what happened, and yet we struggle ourselves to comprehend how many people were killed in Auschwitz. And Pilecki, you know, he called it the new nightmare. That's because he had no word to describe it. And in the beginning, he couldn't fathom why the Nazis were doing it. His first reports about the Holocaust, he's speculating that it must be because they were trying to plunder Europe's Jews and to fund the war effort, because that was somehow a sort of rational explanation, not that they were seeking to kill Jews, that was the purpose. And of course, when Pilecki's reports arrived in London, it triggered the same questions. Why? You know, how is this possible? Can we believe it? And Pilecki's strength is, of course, that he kept on pushing to understand the Nazis' intentions in Auschwitz and didn't look away. And the Allies struggled with that knowledge, but then did look away. And some of the reasons I give in the book, you know, anti-Semitism among Allied officials, but I think the one that touches on our own time is simply that these were events taking place in another part of the continent to people not directly linked to the war efforts, to the success of the Allies, and it was possible to look away. And that's why when we think about Ukraine, I think today it's just another reminder of how we mustn't become inured to the atrocities in that war.
Yeah, it shows how weak the stance of human rights is. I mean, it's just the weakest part of what's happening in a war, strangely. Yeah, I mean, the Allies didn't react to these messages, It's an interesting thing that Pilecki is still so unknown, because his report he came out in English, you told, in 2020. It was translated into German in 2013. And there were barely any reviews at all. It did not cause a ripple. It escaped also my notice, and that's really incredible, because otherwise anything connected to Holocaust is something that is of importance in Germany. But this report did not work in a way. So I very much hope that your book does the job, to put it a bit flippantly. What's the impact of your book in the English version or in the places where it has been translated so far?
But we're approaching almost 500,000 copies sold, worldwide. So that's been amazing, and I've got to speak to audiences across the States, around Europe, and share the story. And it's often the case that I speak to roomfuls of people who have never heard of Pilecki before, and they, like I did when I first came across his story, come away, wanting to find out more about this great forgotten hero. And there's much work to be done. The book is getting made into a film, so fingers crossed that will also be, a platform to really share his story.
It's interesting timing, because your book comes at a time when the eyewitnesses are gone, mostly. And I think now there starts a new era of remembrance or of talking about the Holocaust. And it's interesting that we have a new, not character, but protagonist of what's happening, and who tells a new story. And as you say, he takes it over. It's not a victim narrative anymore, but it's somebody who took action, who says that, we always have the possibility to act. That's very significant, I think.
Well, I think also that special quality of Pilecki's story, in that he arrived at the camp at its beginning and then had to understand each of those steps by which the Nazis arrived at the final solution in the camp. So he becomes our guide, as it were, to this history. And, I know that for many people contemplating Auschwitz, the Holocaust, is incredibly hard. I know I myself didn't, grapple with it beyond a typical school education until I came across Pilecki's story. And I also know that during the years of research, when you're dealing with incredibly difficult matter to tell the story, that I would actually always myself turn to Pilecki, as he was an inspiration to the men in the camp, and persuaded them that resistance was possible and meaningful. I think, he comes across in the book in the same way. He's this source of great courage that helps us all confront the horrors of the Holocaust. I know that I turn to him, his story, his actions often when confronting the horrors of the camp, and I think he can be inspiring for a new generation to tackle the Holocaust.
Yeah, so we will be asking, what would Witold do in such moments, so to make the inspiration a bit more concrete. Yeah, we've talked now here. Maybe you have questions or remarks that you would share? Yes, please. Oh,
yes.
Thank you. I would say Witold Pilecki was not so unknown in the last years, and the Swiss edition of Errol Fussli is the name of this edition. They published his report in German language about 2015, I think, and I wrote a review for German Weekly. And even if you have a look to Wikipedia in English or German, you can find a lot about Witold Pilecki, or the magazine Der Spiegel and others. They made reports, quite good reports, but of course you have to know it, perhaps, for to search for it. But you can find a lot. But this is now a biography, and in this report there is only the time in Auschwitz. It's too short about the time after Auschwitz, until his death. Yes, this is not enough known. And of course, your biography is very important for further information, especially concerning the family and so on. But the report as such, at least at perhaps 2015, is not unknown in Germany, I would say. But if you ask average men on the street, they don't know.
Well, that's a really good comment, and it's also worth adding, of course, that in Poland, Pilecki's story, has been rediscovered, and it's actually one of the great pleasures to sit with Pilecki's family, with Andrzej or Zofia, and their phones are sort of buzzing with messages, and it's like some school teacher headmaster who wants to rename their school the Pilecki High School, or it's some road that's being renamed in his honor. And I've got to travel with Andrzej on some of these ribbon cutting events, and it's wonderful to see how Pilecki's story is now being commemorated in Poland, and hopefully we'll get to celebrate him beyond the sort of narrow circle that knows about him today.
Yeah, you're perfectly right. It's not so unknown, but it has not caused a debate or discussion. When I compare it to things like the novels of Ruth Klüger, that was a sensation that we have this kind of eyewitness account of Auschwitz when she was there, when she was 12. And nothing comparable had happened. And I mean, his was also an eyewitness account, and plus the whole political idea of alerting the world to what was happening there. So that's just what I felt. But you're perfectly right; it's not so unknown.
But I think there is in some ways a reason for that, which is the historiographical story, which is that there has been this division between the sort of Polish experience of Auschwitz and the Jewish experience, and that sort of struggle of perspectives has really, in some ways, prevented a sort of coming together and of academics. For me, Pilecki's story, because it actually bridges the early Polish experience in the camp and looks towards the Holocaust in Auschwitz, is a way to bridge these two perspectives on the camp. But I think it's one of the reasons why academics haven't tackled Pilecki's report, because many struggle to embrace a Polish view of Auschwitz. It's largely the early history of the camp is not well written about compared to the latter period.
So you think if Pilecki had been Jewish, it would have been differently received?
Well, it's a very big hypothesis. What I would say is that obviously there has been controversy through, for example, some of the policies of the Polish government in some of its laws that it's enacted about how to talk about the Holocaust, that created a very strong reaction among academics who felt that the ability to write about the history was being curtailed by the Polish government. This was happening in and around the time that Pilecki's reports were being translated, and I think there's a way in which Pilecki's story, can be politicized. Unfortunately, of course, to my mind, because Pilecki himself was one of the great bringers together of people in the camp. I mean, he worked not just with Poles, but with Germans, with Russian POWs, with Jewish members in the underground, and I
should talk a bit more in there.
Yeah, I hope that his story can be a way ultimately for us to sort of embrace both this Polish perspective on Auschwitz and a Jewish one.
Yeah, and I mean the bitter irony is, of course, if he was Jewish, he wouldn't have been able to do what he did. He would have been killed much, definitely. I mean, he would never have such agency. And so also, it's not an accident that also Hermann Langbein was not Jewish. He was imprisoned as a communist, and so could work as a Funktionshäftling, as they were called, and could survive and could organize things.
I mean, it's worth just adding a footnote to that. That I mean, there was also towards the end of the camp a Jewish resistance force at the incredible uprising of the Sonderkommando that had some links to Langbein and the resistance after Pilecki left. But yeah, I often especially to Western audiences, just remind them that what it would be like if the heroes of D-Day in Britain and America were in fact labeled as traitors and enemies of the people, as Pilecki was in Poland in the years after the war. And it's incomprehensible. And Poland has not had the opportunity to celebrate its heroes for as long as others in Europe. And so it's only been in the last 30 years that names like Pilecki have been able to emerge, and that they've been able to use their heroes to also look at some of the darker sides of the Polish experience during the occupation. And of course, that's something that happened in other countries that were occupied by the Nazis, like France. We understand the history of collaboration in France. But of course, I think when we think about France during occupation, we think almost immediately of the French resistance, because of course that's how, I think, for the public, is a way to approach difficult topics of the past. We need our heroes, every country does, in order to see the dark and the light. And Pilecki does that for Poland and hopefully for all of us.
A nice statement. Are there more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, I think I understood that you are trying to get his name onto the list in Yad Vashem, onto the list of the righteous people. And my question is, how is the word is missing me, the understanding of the Israelis? Do they know him well? And what does it need for him to get on this list in Yad Vashem?
Well, to become one of the righteous among the nations is actually quite a specific criteria in which you have to show that the person being nominated directly saved a human life. And so what I had to do a few years ago was track down this lovely old Polish Jewish man, Jarosław Abramov-Neveli, and take him to a notary office to speak of his experience. He and his mother had been living alone in an apartment. They got identified by a blackmailer and were having to pay money. They would run out of money, and in the desperation, the mother, Barbara, turned to one of the neighbors in the apartment and said, "We need help." That neighbor was a good friend of Pilecki. Pilecki was called in as an underground officer, and it's Jarosław's belief that Pilecki then had this blackmailer executed by the underground, and the family was thus saved. So that's a long answer to your question, but we had to have a notarized testimony, which is now submitted to Yad Vashem.
Is he widely known by the Holocaust survivors in Israel, or
Not so much. I mean, he is known because Pilecki, I think, has also become a figure, a national figure in Poland, in as much as the Polish government at times is viewed by the Israeli government as being nationalistic, as being against the proper research or study of the Holocaust. It is a problem, and I think that's why, of course, Jarosław's testimony is so important, because you can't really argue with, an experience of this man who was saved by Pilecki. And of course, it's unfair that Pilecki should be, seen by some as a figure of nationalism, when I think, in fact, Pilecki was a patriot in a sense that is liberal and open, and he believed that anyone who was prepared to fight the Nazis was on his side. And I think, in fact, he helps us understand what true patriotism is, that we can see today when we look at somewhere like Ukraine and compare that to, nationalism or populism in other countries.
I mean, to what extent do you feel that Pilecki's memory is being misused and politicized in Poland?
I think, of course, there are nationalistic groups in Poland that, celebrate Pilecki. My hope is that, by approaching his story objectively, we get to see Pilecki in all of his different nuances, all of his flaws. Pilecki himself was a Catholic. He was a patriot. He came from a conservative background. One of the things that I had to touch upon in introducing Pilecki was that as a small landowner in eastern Poland, before the war, he belonged to a class that almost certainly shared anti-Semitic sentiments. I could find no evidence of Pilecki himself, but of course he belonged to a group in which it was part of the discourse that their Jewish neighbors were economically competing with them, and that, of course, for me was really important to address, because it helps understand some of the extraordinary transformation that took part with Pilecki, that I describe in the book, that he was able to see beyond these narrow labels and empathize with the suffering of not just Poles in the camp, who you would expect, but Russian POWs, with these Jewish families from across Europe. And I think that was, a real act of humanity on his part to overcome whatever prejudices he may have had grown up with, lived with in pre-war Poland. And I think I've been successful because I'm often attacked by the, Polish nationalist groups because of my presentation of Pilecki. So I think, I hope that is an indication, in fact, that I've found a way to tell his story honestly and objectively.
Yeah, this bears a lot of weight, because also the name of this institute here is in Pilecki's name, so that's a very integrative figure also for Poland, and spans a lot of political attitudes, I think.
Yeah, well, I think also to answer that question, another way to answer that question about why academics have not, in the West, have not seized on Pilecki's report, is that there has been a lot of snobbery among Western scholars towards Polish scholarship towards Polish sources. I mean, so many books have been written about Auschwitz that don't integrate Polish source material, and that's partly a feature of the fact that because of the Iron Curtain, the Polish scholarship was not shareable, but also I think is because we in the West do have a little bit of a sort of arrogant, myopic view in which prevents us from engaging with Polish material and recognizing its value. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of work for us in the West to do to understand Poland, understand other countries of Eastern and Central Europe, both in terms of their experience of being living under Soviet occupation, domination for all those years, but also just to visit those archives. And I think that's why I'm very honored to be able to speak here tonight at the Pilecki-Institut, because one of their missions is to actually help us outside of Poland access lots of research material. And they've got a great website where they translate lots of Polish documents into English, and I think it's a great resource for scholars to help bring attention to source material.
Yeah, thank you very much. That really broadens the picture still. Is there still a question or a remark? Because otherwise I think we could close this evening. What do you think, Patrick?
Yeah, I think we could close it.
Yes, I'm very happy to answer any specific questions when I sign books. So please do buy a copy from our wonderful bookseller right behind you, and I would love to answer any questions and sign books. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming.